Thank you all so much for coming along this evening. Wanted to start by acknowledging we're on Ngunnawal country. I think this is an incredible part of Australia. Love living here and would like to acknowledge Ngunnawal people's connection to this place, hundreds and hundreds of generations, and the way that they've looked after it. And certainly every time there is a welcome to country, sort of feel grateful for the way that they are so welcoming given everything that's happened. So I want to acknowledge their elders past and present. I'm going to hand over to the amazing Tash on my team, who's going to run the event this evening.
Hello folks, and thank you so much for coming along. This is the second town hall event that Senator Pocock has had this year. We've been running these events for 2 years now, and in fact, the election anniversary was yesterday, so they've been a fantastic way to hear firsthand from the community about what matters most to you. As always, the main purpose of these events is so that David can hear directly from you. So when we get to the Q&A, please don't hesitate to throw your hand up. There'll be somebody with a roving microphone. And over the past week, David's been inviting the community to submit your questions over Slido, which should be, yep. There's a QR code behind me, so you can scan that. You can't submit any new questions now, but what you can do is upvote questions that are already there. So if you want to hear a particular question answered, please just press the thumbs up next to it. There will also be an opportunity to continue the conversation after formal proceedings close. So just find someone wearing a Team Pocock shirt like this and we can help you. As most of you know, we're here on the back of the federal budget being handed down last week, which we're really looking forward to summarising tonight. There's been plenty of other things going on that David's keen to update you on, as well as talking about what's coming up. But before that, we're really fortunate to be joined by two special guest speakers tonight. Sue Wiebeck, who is the CEO of the Domestic Violence Crisis Service in the ACT, and Sharon Friel, who is an Australian Research Council Laureate Fellow and Professor of Health Equity here at the ANU. Thank you so much to both of you. Sue is an LGBTIQA+ community advocate, as well as a passionate violence prevention and respectful relationships educator and advocate. She's been working in the community sector in aligned violence response and primary prevention spaces for over 20 years, and she sits on a number of government advisory councils. Please welcome Sue.
Thanks, Tash. And obviously, if I've been working in the sector for 20 years, I started when I was 3. I too would like to acknowledge that we're on Ngunnawal country and pay my respects to elders past and present, and acknowledge that in the work that I do in responding to domestic, family and intimate partner violence, we have a long way to go in working alongside First Nations community members and learning from them in the disproportionate impacts of colonisation that have impacted community. They have, particularly Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women, have kept their families safe and strong and connected to community and culture in the face of insurmountable adversity. And we have much to learn. I had hoped that I might be coming here to talk about the really great news that we had all been sold in the media about federal government funding for domestic, family, intimate partner violence. Unfortunately, I'm not the good news bear that I had hoped I would be. What we saw was an unfortunate response to the desperate cries of community to actually partner with frontline agencies to work towards ending violence against women and children, but also working with perpetrators of violence and responding to violence where it occurs in our community. We basically got a really large announcement, which was that the federal government was going to invest $1 billion over 4 years. Now, that's more zeros than I know what to do with, but the reality is that was to fund an already existing program that they've just made a name change to. And that program pieces out to a $5,000 payment as advertised to people who are escaping violence. The fine print on that is $1,500 is cash and $3,500 is in goods and services. And depending on where you live in this country, depends on what type of goods and services that you can actually access. And $1,500 in cash is essentially a week's worth of bread, milk, nappies, maybe half a year rent, and let's forget about having electricity. So that doesn't create the financial security that our community members actually need in order to actually escape violence in their lives. Also, the requirements around accessing that payment are really narrow. It has to be in relation to intimate partner violence. So we are seeing more and more elders in our community needing to flee because of elder abuse. We're seeing more and more people in our community because of violence within their family group, but not their intimate partner, who are not going to be able to access this resource. And you also have to apply and be successful within 12 weeks of changing your living circumstances due to the violence you're experiencing. Frontline services like the one that I run are responding to people all of the time, and people who experience deep trauma because of the impacts of violence in their life are not in a position within 12 weeks of uplifting their life to provide all of the documentation that is required in this program to receive a payment that actually isn't going to sustain them beyond maybe a couple of weeks. The aptitude for paperwork and the ability around that currently really is a better investment in Centrelink and trying to get onto payments, which is the point I ultimately make, which is the number one thing this government could have done would have been to raise or increase the funds attached to income support payments and parenting payments, and they've chosen not to do that. The announcements around rent assistance being increased by 10%, or a maximum of $9 per week. Now, given them recently when Anglicare did their analysis around affordable rentals in the ACT in the week that they did that snapshot, there was 0 affordable rentals for a person on a parenting payment, job seeker or youth allowance, let alone a couple with 2 children who are both working minimum wage jobs. So the reality is we've continued to systemically embed a situation where people cannot choose to leave violence in their intimate partner relationships purely because they cannot afford to do so. Not to mention the lack of investment around family law interventions and support around legal assistance as well, as we see an increase in use of those systems to further abuse people in those intimate partner relationships. So the money that has been allocated in the budget towards community legal centres deliberately excludes women's legal services across the country from accessing that money. The good news is Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander legal responses are included in that, but they have deliberately excluded community-based legal services specifically for women. The bulk of that money will go to legal aid environments, which is disappointing because our women's legal service system are able to participate in legal practices that legal aid aren't actually participating in or funded to participate in. So ultimately, where we've gotten to is a budget full of smoke and mirrors. Amazingly, we're all going to get a $300 rebate on our energy bills, which I think is ultimately the thing that's supposed to make us all feel a little bit better because at least everyone's going to get it. But we are stuck in an environment in response services of trying to work out what we do in the budget to continue to maintain services where we're seeing month-on-month increase for service demand across all areas of service. In 2021, we serviced 850 people in the ACT community each month. We now service 1,150 people each month. We've had no substantial increase in funding. And so we are essentially at a point where that $300 energy rebate for those of us that don't need it, that's a good donation to make to a community organisation in your local area. But unfortunately, there was nothing in the budget that actually substantially changes what the Commonwealth Government has described as a national crisis. It just continues to be a silent epidemic that we do have solutions for, but we certainly don't have money for.
Thanks, Sue. I think we did some maths in the office the other day and we worked out that there was more in the budget for private planes for the Prime Minister and his ministers than there was for frontline workers. I think it was in the order of 4,000 workers that they could have afforded with that money. So, disappointed. There's no other word to explain it. Thank you so much, Sue. Sharon Friel is a professor of health equity in the School of Regulation and Global Governance here at the Australian National University. She's also a director of Planetary Health Equity Hothouse and Australian Research Centre for Health Equity. She's hugely credentialed and we're very lucky to have her here to speak about intergenerational equity. Thank you so much, Sharon.
Thank you for the invitation to come and speak with you. I also just want to acknowledge that we're meeting on Ngunnawal lands, unceded lands, pay respects to elders past, present in the room. So I'm going to start by saying it could have been much worse. I think it's really important, having listened to Sue, and Sue stole a lot of my thunder, but that's okay. It could have been much worse. But I do think this budget was, we were just talking beforehand, was a sort of a quiet budget. It was a very tame budget. But in the many, many silences that existed within the budget, that cuts away at people's lives. And so right now we have massive inequities, current inequities. And those inequities are being exacerbated and locked in for future generations, so the intergenerational aspect. And when reflecting on the budget, I suppose it gives us the opportunity to ask, what's the point? What's the point? The idea of having a freedom to lead a life that we have reason to value seems remarkably important. And to do that, we need three things. We need enough material resource, we need a sense of control over our lives, and we need a voice in the decision-making processes that affect our lives. And we saw some of that being enabled in the budget, and we saw some of it being really stymied. So I won't rehearse what Sue spoke about in terms of the cost of living crisis, in terms of the marginalisation of those already marginalised within society, and the ongoing under-recognition of First Nations peoples in Australia. What Sue didn't mention was climate change, which of course is a massive issue for us in Australia. And climate change exacerbates the social inequities within Australia, so whether that's through the heat stress, through the floods, through the displacement of people. And that I'm a health person, so I'm going to connect everything to health and well-being. That exacerbates our health, both our physical and our mental health risks. So to do anything about these issues, these current and intergenerational inequities, we have to do something about the environmental, the social drivers. So did we see any sort of thinking about the economy in a way that might be different, that gives us some hope? So in 2022, Treasurer Chalmers introduced the Measuring What Matters framework, which is about, in essence, trying to advance a well-being economy within society. If you want to know anything about well-being economies, speak to Catherine Trebek. She's in the room. Catherine was one of the co-founders of the Global Wellbeing Economy Alliance. And what a well-being economy, so there we have it in this Measuring What Matters. A well-being economy provides an opportunity to think differently about the purpose of the economy. We are a society, we are not an economy. We are a society, and how does the economy, how could the economy, how should the economy work for us? The idea of having a surplus, and we were talking before, having a surplus and then just stroking it because we've got a surplus, how nonsensical is that? How do we use that to better our lives and to prevent climate change? So did the budget this year do anything around that? First of all, this was not an equity budget. It was touted as that. It was not an equity budget. It was tame, it was quietly political, and as I said, all those silences have profound effects on people's lives. Health is a real canary in the coal mine for exposing the state of inequity within societies and here in Australia. The drivers of our health, of our premature death, of our burden of disease sit actually predominantly outside the healthcare system. It sits in climate change mitigation and adaptation policy, it sits in social policy, it sits in domestic violence responses. So recognising that many of those factors that Sue pointed towards in the budget response doesn't go far enough at all to address health inequities. We had no commitment to fund the National Preventative Health Strategy in this budget. And the neglect of prevention is going to exacerbate health inequities within this country, full stop. So we need funding for that. There was no commitment to fund the National Health and Climate Change Strategy, which of course is critical to responding to the locked-in climate change that we've already got. And so without any funding to implement that strategy and the associated programmes is going to exacerbate the health inequities because it's the most socially disadvantaged groups who experience climate change most. The security dimensions that Sue was speaking to, and I just want to pick up because I just thought this was marvellous on the energy bill. So there we are, wahoo, we get $300. And that goes a long way, of course, but one, that means you need a house. And two, it means you need an energy account. And analysis, beautiful analysis by Lee White and colleagues looking at energy poverty and energy insecurity in Australia shows that that's not the case for many people in rural and remote Australia. So it doesn't help. And I would also say in the attention, these financial security discussions that we saw, or the announcements we saw in the budget, what it did was deflect away from the fact that we're not actually addressing the policies and actions that push wealth up. There is no pooling of the socioeconomic advantage that happens in Australia. We have one of the most unequal countries in the OECD, but yet we don't touch those policy levers, and we can have a whole discussion about that. And then, so finally, for climate change. So we have this incredible mandate to do something in Australia. You know, the population has spoken. We have to do something about it. But really, we've done nothing. There was in the budget, there was one mention of climate change in the Treasurer's speech, 2 references to net zero in the context of climate action for growth, and 0 mentions around mitigation and adaptation. Climate change is going to drive intergenerational inequities. It locks in what we've currently got and exacerbates going forward. That's a political choice that was made in this budget. This government has said we do not care about inequities within this country, and frankly, I think that's disgraceful. So, thank you.
Sharon, how do I enrol in your course? Thank you so much. That was very interesting. I feel like I could definitely listen to you for 3 years straight. So the other thing that I should mention too is that the Senator has a duty of care bill currently in the Senate that does talk about this intergenerational equity and duty of care to future generations for climate change. So I think we should be talking to you a lot more. last week was really full on in our office with Parliament sitting, which is why you'll see some very tired faces around the room. The federal budget was handed down, plus a range of other bits and pieces that pop up every day. So there were some late nights and early mornings, and we were all pretty wrecked by the time the weekend came around. Least, probably most of all, David. So please excuse him if he looks exhausted. I love to have a stab at him. So David's going to provide a brief summary of the budget and an update on everything else that's been going on before we move on to the Q&A portion of the evening.
Thanks, Tash. I've been told to be briefer with my remarks, so we have more time for questions, feedback from the last. So I thought maybe we just put the budget in a slide. Thank you to Sharon and Sue for your contribution there, your expertise and the work you do. The overall sense was that could have been worse, but it was fairly underwhelming. We sent out a fairly detailed breakdown. We're just going to run you through some of the big things. The centerpiece was this Future Made in Australia. They're using production tax credits, which I think is really good policy, very much centered on hydrogen and critical minerals, and a lot of the spending is 2027, 2028, 2029, so it's kind of in the distance, nothing soon. I think there was a huge missed opportunity with household electrification. In health, they did some stuff around the PBS. Bulk billing in Canberra is still a huge issue. We know how hard it is just to get into see a GP, then you're paying the biggest gap fee in the country, and we just have a shortage of GPs, and it's going to take a specific strategy for the ACT. So I'm going to keep pushing them on that. We've talked about rent assistance. One of the missed opportunities was the Housing Australia Future Fund. Talking to community housing providers, they're saying they've got capacity to essentially double what Labor have said. They've committed to 30,000 over the next 5 years. CHPs are saying they could do 60,000 easily. So we were asking them to double it. They didn't do that. We've talked about most of the rest here. I mean, the biggest thing to me, and I guess was summed up, is that we chose not to increase payments that we know leave people in poverty. And I guess this comes back to the question about who do we, what do we want to be as a country? Do we want a country where if you're on social security payments, if you're between jobs or can't work for whatever reason, that you live above the poverty line? Or are we saying to those people, actually, you can live in poverty and we'll all crack on with our lives? And unfortunately, we've missed that opportunity this budget. Some of the intergenerational stuff, again, missed opportunities around HECS. We saw the big announcement that they were slashing student debt by changing the rate at which it was indexed. Anyone with the HECS debt here, you're still going to be indexed on June 1. Anything you've paid off before that, too bad, you'll still get indexed on that. So that was a missed opportunity. And then job-ready graduates. For anyone studying humanities, you're currently getting screwed. They jacked up arts courses 120%, and that has to change. Biodiversity was, there was basically nothing for nature. A little bit more for bureaucracy, but absolutely nothing for nature. And I think a real indictment on this government, given they've talked about no new extinctions, and yet we're seeing so many species heading that way at an alarming rate. A bit of a Canberra lens. The big thing was the AIS funding, which is subject to a business case. Very welcome funding. Again, I view this sort of funding, whether it's culture institutions or AIS, very welcome. Very much Canberra the capital. I'm really keen for us to see Canberra the city funding as well. And outside of that, I don't think there was a lot in there. Some welcome things. The light rail planning, they announced 50 million, only 25 million over the next 4 years. So the next 25 million comes after that at some stage. What's next? All right, quick. I don't know, people may have seen in the news last last week, Labor and the Greens did a deal and rammed a whole bunch of legislation through the House and the Senate in a day. I was pretty cranky about it, particularly the where are we? The way we tax gas. We basically get next to nothing for our gas, and it's something that the crossbench has been pushing for months and months and months. Labor they propose a really weak change to the petroleum resource rent tax, and the crossbench, the Greens had been hammering them on it, and then the Greens sort of just caved and passed it, and so we've locked that in for now. But I think this is something that we really have to make an election issue. In 2022, we exported $93 billion worth of LNG, and we didn't receive a cent, not a cent for that gas. And a number of the big multinational gas exporters minimized their corporate tax below 1%. So at the same time, we're saying to students, sorry about your HECS debt, you're just going to have to live with it. We're saying to people trying to see a GP, we can't afford to do anything on Medicare, we're just allowing our gas to be exported for nothing. There's some big stuff coming up. As I said, the Future Made in Australia, they're going to have to legislate that. Environment Protection Australia, Labor have decided to kick environmental law reform beyond the next election, which again is devastating for the environment. Our environmental laws are broken. They continue to approve all sorts of fossil fuel projects using our existing laws. And so rather than dealing with the root cause, which is our environmental laws, Labor are proposing an independent body to oversee our broken laws and try and frame that up as some big win for the environment. So that'll also be in Parliament at some point, and then the Help to Buy bill, which the Greens currently oppose. This is basically the bank of mum and dad for people who don't have rich parents. In principle, I think it's actually not bad policy. It's not a first homeowner grant that we know just jacks up the prices of houses. This is allowing people to give the government equity in their home and actually, I guess, bring forward the date at which they can actually get into the market. Right, that was quick. Now to you guys. I'm keen to hear, what people are thinking. Are we going to go to Slido first? Yeah. Or, okay, we'll go to Slido and then we'll come to questions. What have we got? There's another one here.
All right, so because there's people participating at home, we want to go to some quick questions from people that have been asked online. The first one is, how can we address the growing housing and homelessness problem and shortage of social and affordable housing? Would removing land tax help attract investment?
There's lots we could be doing. I don't think removing land tax would do that. I think removing stamp duty allows more transactions. Talking to tax experts, land tax is a far more progressive tax, a better way to do things. Currently in the ACT, I think we're getting slugged for both. You pay stamp duty and then you pay land tax. I'd love to see the ACT government speed up that transition. But when it comes to housing, one of the things I've been pushing for is to treat it like the crisis it is, and we should be looking at everything. And for me, you've got to start with the big picture of what's housing for. Is housing a human right, something that everyone in our community should be able to afford, or is this an investment vehicle for wealth creation? And if we all decide that it's something we want people to afford, then you've got to look at our tax system, which currently incentivizes it towards the investment end, and really, I guess, stacks things in the interest of investors, where it's arguably easier to buy your second home than your first. And so the capital gains tax discount and negative gearing need to be looked at. There's ways to reform them that I think are fair. Senator Jackie Lambie and I actually got the Parliamentary Budget Office to do some modelling on 5 different options of how you start to change this. Where are those details? If anyone wants to, we can, yeah, on the website. So we've chucked them up on the website. It's actually really fascinating. For the first time, the Budget Office took into account predicted behavioural change, and so there's some really fascinating modelling. And if we can change this, there's other research that says that we would likely return home ownership to 1990s levels just by making those changes. So I'd say we have to start at the tax system. I think we've then got to look at things like approvals and infill. I think everything should really be on the table. We've got to be looking at Airbnbs that come at the expense of long-term rentals. Let's have a conversation about immigration in Australia and what that should look like over the long term. So I think there's a huge number of things we could be doing. What I'm hearing from the major parties is that they're all about home ownership. They want to see this solved, but they're going to put up, in Labor's case, like a decent scheme in the HAF that is not really anywhere near the scale that we need. And in the coalition's plans, you can just use your super to try and get into the housing market. I mean, I think the other thing that I didn't say earlier is far more investment in social and affordable housing. We have to see the federal government really step up into that space and provide a lot more. And I think look at sort of key worker housing, nurses, teachers. No one bats an eye when you talk about defence housing and people in defence getting houses. And I think we need to start broadening that out to people we really value in our communities.
Next one. What do you see as the main legislative issues that will be taking your time this year, and why are they big? What issues aren't on the cards but should be? NDIS is big. There's some real uncertainty around that, and we're sort of waiting to see what exactly the government's proposing there. The Aged Care Act was meant to be rewritten this year, sort of slowly being kicked down the road. So I'm interested to see if they bring that forward. Environmental law reform was meant to be one of the big things. Again, that's been punted down the road, and I'm really concerned there's this worrying trend with the Labor government that they're not willing to tackle these hard things, and they're kicking a lot of them down the road and sort of dealing with some low-hanging fruit and things that are a lot less controversial. What are the other big things coming through? Yeah, electoral reform is, for me, getting more and more urgent leading into an election. I helped get a Senate committee up looking at AI, artificial intelligence, and one of the things I'm sort of focusing more on is the potential influence of artificial and use of an influence of artificial intelligence at the election. And it's frankly terrifying what we will very likely see if we don't have the political will to deal with that beforehand. So that's become a real focus lately. And again, the crossbench is pushing the government on this to do something. Australians want electoral law reform. It just seems like the major parties don't. And there's a bunch of other things. Gambling, advertising reform. We're coming up to a year since the Murphy Review, which was a sort of multi-partisan report that said we should ban gambling advertising on TV, online. It's not working for Australia. Again, Labor are dragging their heels and haven't responded yet. And the final one from online, and then we'll go to the room. What is being done by this government to address the inequalities between private and public education?
Not enough. I mean, I know this is a huge concern of so many people. I think to Minister Clare's credit, he's been doing a lot of work in this space. They've been renegotiating agreements with states and territories around school funding. The ACT is one of the only jurisdictions where public schools are funded at 100%, but talking to teachers and principals, that's not enough. And so I think if that's just the goal, to try and get public schools up to this sort of arbitrary level that was determined years ago, we're not going to be able to provide world-class education. And I think that's something that Australians want. It's an investment in our future. So I'd love to see them do more. It's certainly something that we've raised in conversations with the minister.
Thanks, Dave. So we'll go to questions in the room. I might give the microphone to one of my colleagues.
Run, Tom.
Thank you, David, and to the previous
Thanks for coming.
speakers. I appreciated your assessment of the budgets, the pluses and the minuses, but to me there was one glaring omission. There's a massive increase in the budget for what I call war expenditure, euphemistically called defence expenditure. But it's actually not for the defence of Australia. The sort of equipment that's being bought is equipment that's really purposed for attacking another country, not for defending Australia. But the increase in the defence budget is enormous. And many of us don't think that we're really likely to be attacked in the next few years. And we really don't see the need for this massive increase in defence expenditure. A similar country like New Zealand has a much more modest defence budget. Very few people have commented on this massive increase, even though it's such a big increase and such an important part of the budget. So I'd be interested in your views. Do you support this massive increase? And why do you think there has been so little comment about it?
I mean, I think the second part of your question first, I think there probably hasn't been as much comment about it because I think the majority of Australians seem to support increased defence spending. They see on the TV the rising tensions and they want Australia to be well prepared. I've certainly raised concerns about some of the proposed spending on things like submarines that we're being told the threat is urgent, we desperately need these things, but we're going to get them sometime in the future. No one can really give us a date. Doesn't make a lot of sense to me. If it was really about defending Australia, there's a bunch of people in that space who've sort of pointed out what could be spent to have the right defences in place at an absolute fraction of that cost. I think one of the realities when it comes to defence is that this is an issue where there is sort of total bipartisan. Labor and the coalition are both sort of heading in the same direction, and so as a crossbench, I think that you can scrutinise procurements and strategy and all the rest, but I think when it comes to the bigger sort of direction, it's essentially a done deal. But I certainly hear concerns raised on all sides of this from Canberrans, to be honest, like that we're spending too much. Others saying, well, we're not spending enough, and we should be spending more. One of my big concerns in the defence space is that we seem to have an open checkbook for machinery and weapons. But when it comes to looking after Australians who have broken themselves in the service of our country, we're not doing the same thing. And I see that as a real disconnect with the way we talk about defence, is that we have people who serve Australia and then we don't look after them. And I would love to see more focus on defence personnel and looking after them. But a lot of the focus seems to be on the big new weapons systems and all the rest. I'd love to chat more and hear what you think could be done there.
Yeah, just going back to the tax question on the housing, the land tax adds $8,000 to $10,000 to a house, which equates to $150 to $200 a week cost to that owner, who then wants to rent that house out. Now, if you buy the same house in Queanbeyan, you don't pay that. So you're literally pushing the investor to say, I can buy a house in Canberra or a house in Queanbeyan. If I buy it in Queanbeyan, I make 150, 200 more a week. I've actually put to a couple of politicians before, if you were to rent to, for example, Argyle Housing or somebody that provides the house to underprivileged people, I actually have houses in Queanbeyan, not Queanbeyan, sorry, in Goulburn, who go through Argyle Housing, that goes to somebody in Housing Commission. If they could remove the land tax in the ACT for people who do the same thing, you would attract people into the ACT to provide housing to go to Housing Commission. It's not viable for me to buy a house in the ACT the same as I can buy in Goulburn. It's a direct negativity to that. Now, it's not about me making more money, it's about being able to pay the mortgage. I keep my rents down so that the person can rent at a reasonable rate, but the maths don't make sense to be able to buy the house. I actually tried to buy one and it just wouldn't work. So not remove it for everybody, not take land tax away, just if they provide it to somebody in that situation.
So there's a couple of great schemes that are doing exactly that here in the ACT, Homeground and Rentwell, yep. And so if you rent your house out at 25% below market rate, don't pay land tax. Okay, so I mean, so the thinking is that my understanding of the land tax system. Again, this is not my area of expertise, and is very much a territory issue. Is that you pay more land tax if it's an investment property than if it's your residence? Yes, and so they're saying if you rent this out at 25% below market rate, you don't pay land tax. And if there's a difference, if you're still losing money, I think you get a tax deductible sort of certificate for that. So yeah, I guess it's one way. It's not perfect. I think we need to see more investment in social and affordable housing and some sort of long-term plan to have a system where you don't have to have rich parents, or you don't have to have got onto the property ladder early on to then be able to stay in there.
David, I just want to go back to that first question around AUKUS and nuclear submarines. I mean, we're spending $368 billion on 8 submarines, and obviously that's an enormous amount of money. And just a comment on this, Professor Hugh White from the ANU has written a very good essay on all this, in which he outlines the flawed nature of the whole show. And if anyone's interested, they should read that, because it's just not a feasible go, according to Professor White.
He certainly provokes the establishment, Hugh. I think he's got some really good stuff to say there.
While we're talking defence, it seems to me, by observing the US, that the way we're going to be attacked by foreign adversaries is much more likely to be through cultural and social manipulation via misinformation spread on social media and other avenues, rather than via hardware attacks. Has there been anything in the budget to ramp up our information security?
I don't actually know. We can come back to you on that, but it's definitely a huge threat. My understanding is that we've been warned for a long time now that the biggest threat is homegrown extremism, and we haven't seen the same focus on that. But we can look into that and get back to you. And again, I think this whole area of misinformation and disinformation, we have to find a way to deal with it. And I think you add AI onto that, and we're in a whole different space. So yeah, I agree, it's urgent.
Thanks, David. Well, firstly, thanks for all your hard work. This is a question in relation to regulation and deregulation across the economy. One of the great mantras of the neoliberal view of the economy was, if you deregulate everything, everything will be fine. And yet we see, after 20 or 30 years of deregulation, massive wage theft, non-payment of superannuation, examples in the construction industry where dodgy buildings are being built. We see the PwC scandals, we see airline scandals, we see banking scandals. I'm just actually starting to wonder, someone who's now 72, if we actually need to start looking at re-regulating some sections of the economy to get some fairness back. It would appear that a lot of our official regulators are fairly toothless.
There certainly has been a big focus from the Labor government. They've had 2 big tranches of industrial relations reform and addressed a number of the things that you raised around wage theft, super theft. I think it's identified as an issue. I guess when it comes to regulation, one of the things that I think about and really try and push in there is trying to sort of draw the distinction between big businesses where we've seen profits increase and we've seen a huge lack of competition in Australia. We've got big duopolies outside of the duopolies that, Qantas, Virgin, Coles and Woolies. There's highly concentrated industries when it comes to banks or power companies. I think that's something that also needs focus. But yes, absolutely, regulation of those industries in terms of industrial relations and all sorts of other things. But how do you have a system that at the same time isn't imposing all of these layers of complexity on small businesses who don't have the same, I think of them very differently to, if you're a big business and you're listed, your whole thing is you need to grow. If you want to be successful on the stock market, you need to be growing year on year on year. It's this never-ending growth. Whereas I think for most small businesses, it's about providing for your family, putting your kid through school. And so how do we have a system where you're really ensuring that there's a lot of scrutiny on the big businesses, but you're not stifling smaller businesses who are, I think, the backbone of our economy in many ways. But a lot of the big businesses pull the profit. So I agree, it's an issue and something that we've really tried to balance with industrial relations reform. And I think, there's been some good work done there and some sort of good balance. But I think it's something there's always more to do.
Thanks.
I'm in trouble.
Well, it was your first slide, and it follows on from the man's question there. So your first slide was about the lobbyists, and it just it strikes me over and over and over again the massive inequities in power of the different lobbyists, and questions around the arms industry, the tech industry, the gambling industry, the fossil fuel industry, the finance sector, who have just gazillions of dollars flowing into their lobbyists and the big law firms that support them. So it's just really asking in the reform of the system that you're pointing towards, how do you see ways of managing those lobbyists and interests? And I'm just really curious, how do you navigate that on what's the day in the life of David Pocock navigating these different lobbyists who are coming to you?
It's a huge issue. Before I became a politician, I knew it was an issue. You hear about lobbying, influence. Since I've been in there, it is truly mind-blowing. Just, one, the scale of it, but 2, how terrible our regulations are. Next to non-existent. So forgive me if people have heard me talk about this before, but we have some of the loosest lobbying laws in Australia. You're only a lobbyist if you work for a third-party lobbying firm. If you work in government relations for Qantas or Santos or Woodside, you're not a lobbyist. You're not a lobbyist at all. All you do is you go to a politician, get a sponsored pass, and that gives you 3 years of unfettered access to Parliament House. You swipe in, no one knows you're in there. And I've raised concerns in the Senate with government, finally managed to get a Senate inquiry into this, and we had hundreds of 350 submissions, I think, basically all saying, do something. And the things we were hearing was a decent register, far more transparency about who's in the building. There shouldn't be 2,000 people with access all areas passes that no one knows who they are. The other thing that came up was ministerial diaries should be published at least quarterly. And the the major parties recommended, as part of the sort of recommendations, their number one recommendation was that there be another inquiry into lobbying. I kid you not. So it's one of those things, everyone knows it's a problem, but there's just not the political will. And I think it's until more and more Australians say, hang on, we send you to Canberra to make decisions on our behalf, and it doesn't seem like those are the decisions you're being made, and at the same time you're sponsoring access to all these companies, and we don't know. And so I put mine up I do sponsor passes, I put them up on my website. And so I think that's, in terms of transparency, there's a lot of work to do. In terms of navigating it, I think access is a good thing, and I try and meet with, leading into big legislation, try and meet with stakeholders, meet with community groups, civil society, to really hear the diverse range of views. And we'll often hold roundtables where you get them all in the same room, and it's fascinating because you'll see them sort of sparring in the media and think, well, there's absolutely no common ground here, but you get them in front of each other and you can often see, well, actually there's this area that everyone's actually happy to live with, and that's sometimes a good starting point. So yeah, it can be overwhelming at times, but kind of just do our best with the current system and try and change it.
Thanks for your advocacy on housing, particularly. Full disclosure, one of the organisations that I sought funding for, I'm the voluntary vice chair of, but we did not see the Housing Peaks, Homelessness Australia, the Community Housing Industry Association or National Shelter refunded in this budget despite significant discussions with the Minister's office, and it seems that there is a bipartisan preference to use consulting firms rather than fund systemic advocacy peaks who can be a nuisance to you throughout the year. And I just wonder what we can, if anything, we can do about that, because in its 50th year, National Shelter faces the very real prospect of trading insolvent.
Well, Trav, firstly, thanks for all the great work you do at Shelter ACT and Emma and the team at National Shelter. And I don't know what to say. It's disgraceful that there wasn't funding for those peak organisations. Given the scale of the funding that was being asked for, it's absolute pocket change in terms of the budget. I don't know why, but it's certainly something that we're going to keep hammering them on. It makes no sense. With the current sort of economic climate, it's the community sector that's picking up the pieces. When a government chooses to leave people in poverty, who then has to go and advocate on their behalf and work with them? It's the community sector. And so you can't make the decision to leave people in poverty and then decide not to actually fund community organisations. So we'll keep, I don't know why, but we'll certainly keep pushing them. And I think, turning up the heat on other local representatives. My sense is most Canberrans would want Homelessness Australia and National Shelter to be funded for the important work that they do. And so I think it's finding ways to really turn the heat up on other MPs.
So we kind of talked a lot a lot tonight about the issues facing young people. So I'm wondering what your biggest concern is when it comes to intergenerational equity and the issues facing young people today. Obviously, we're on a university campus, and what your plan in the coming year is, especially heading into an election season, like what your plan is to put it in front of Labor and make them take action.
I mean, I think in the long run, climate and biodiversity will be the two things that we're all judged on. And I don't see a plan. 43% by 2030 is not in line with the science of a safe future, and I'm hearing next to nothing about adaptation. I think we have a fund that spends about $200 million a year. Experts are saying we need to be spending in the order of, I think it was $3.5 to $5 billion a year on adaptation, and we're just not seeing it. And every year that we don't do that, it's going to be harder. So, on climate, the duty of care bill that you all have been amazing pushing, I think is a big part of that, of really trying to shift the time horizon for the decision makers from how do I make a decision that's going to be good for the lobbyists, they're not going to give me too much heat, I can get through the next election, I can sell this dumb future gas strategy, and it'll be someone else's problem. How do we force them to say, well, actually, how will this affect young people and future generations? And I think one part of that is that legislating a duty of care bill. I mean, the other part is environmental law reform. In 2005, Anthony Albanese, as a MP, introduced his own private members bill to add a climate trigger to our environmental laws. And he talked about the urgency of it. This is the same government that says that they won't add a climate trigger. And so it kind of points out the absurdity of it, but I think it also really worryingly points out the state capture of the major parties by the fossil fuel industry. Like to come out with a future gas strategy in 2024, given what we know and what we're seeing, I don't know how you explain that. So I think leading into the election, we have to, and this is a real challenge, I think, in the current economic climate, is that there are so many Australians doing it so tough to then be trying to say to people, listen, we've got to force politicians to do more on climate is hard, is tough. And, biodiversity, a lot of people, Labor don't seem to care about. So how do we get people to care more about this incredible place? And how do we live here like we're here for a long time? How do we make decisions like we want to actually hand this on to our kids and for them to see all the things that we've seen and enjoy? So I don't know exactly what that looks like, but we're certainly starting to frame up, I guess, what I want to take to the election and really try and get on the table. Everything from duty of care to a really strong 2035 commitment to how do we take biodiversity seriously. But I think it's a really good question. And if anyone's got ideas, please sing out, get in touch. My election platform at the last election was very much sort of crowdsourced, and I plan to do the same thing. Like, all the solutions are here, but I think we've got a real opportunity to make, take a lot of these issues to the election and get a lot more people talking about them.
Hi, thank you. At a time that I think that we should be raising our humanitarian intake, there is going to be a race to the bottom in this election in terms of immigration and reducing our immigration numbers. I wonder what your views on that are. I think you're right. I think if you look at the way that we've dealt with what happened in Ukraine versus what we're doing for Gaza, huge discrepancy. Massive. I think 11,500 humanitarian places for Gaza. For Ukraine. And for Gaza, it's been 340. So I think this is something that we need to look at as a country. How do we be generous there?
I do worry that if we don't have a sensible debate around immigration as a country going forward, what should that look like? If we just leave it to the government of the day and then we see this kind of backlash, you leave it open to Peter Dutton and Pauline Hanson to really pounce on that sort of vacuum and lack of genuine conversation about what does it look like to grow? What would Canberra look like at 800,000 people? Are we going to densify? What are the there's going to be very real impacts on the environment if we decide to grow to that scale. What does it mean for water? Like, these are all things that I just don't hear anyone talking about. It's like, it's not really like an informed conversation. And so I'd love to have that debate rather than the fear mongering. And what's the latest thing is just to blame international students, right? If we just have less of them, it's all sorted. Again, like, let's look at the root causes of the housing crisis rather than this sort of reactionary politics. But on a humanitarian stuff, absolutely. Like, there's so much to do there. And it's something that myself and my team have done a lot trying to push the government, particularly on Gaza. I guess that's front and center, and just truly horrifying to see what's happening there.
Oh, hi. I just wanted to go back to health as an issue. So, and you've talked about, shortages of GPs, some of the health issues, but an issue of real concern to me is access to mental health services. And that's really across the board, whether for young people trying to grapple with what is happening in the world around them and issues they've dealt with. We've had the cutbacks to Medicare sessions. We've got huge workforce issues in the health area, both in terms of nursing, doctors, psychiatrists, psychologists. We don't have any access to proper dental care for people who are the most marginalised and the poorest. So they're issues of real concern to me, and I'm just wondering what your views are on what's going to be possible to do there. Mm-hmm.
Sorry, I should have mentioned mental health in the slides. Hugely disappointing. The lowest investment in mental health since the 2018 budget, and we know how bad things have got through COVID and since then, and we're just not seeing. Their flagship mental health investment is to set up an online service for sort of low-level presentations, and I think their target is 150,000 people. 1 in 3 psychologists have closed their books across the country, and so it's just nowhere near adequate. And so we need more, funding for services to expand. We need to be looking at the pipeline of psychologists and counsellors coming through, and then I think really critically looking at what are some of the root causes of people being so unwell. We shouldn't accept a society that has such widespread mental health issues. It's telling us something is wrong with the way that we are setting things up, and so I think you have to look at things like cost of living for young people. We've got to be looking at what impact is social media having on young people. We've got kids losing their childhoods to this online world, and they're missing out on all of these sort of developmental milestones, and building resilience and spending more time face to face. So there's certainly urgency around the funding, and it was such a huge missed opportunity in the budget. Everyone recognises the need for more mental health services. Hopefully we see something in my IFA, I don't know. But we've certainly spoken to a lot of people who are very disappointed. And then I think start looking at the root causes. We can do both of those things. And so again, if people have ideas, get in touch.
Hi, David. Something I wanted to ask about was, in the budget coverage, I didn't see too much about closing the gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. I know states and territories are looking at treaty, and that's the way to close the gap, but what can the federal government do, and did you see anything in the budget on that?
I didn't see anything. I know they scrapped some funding that was meant to go to Makarrata, sort of truth-telling. So again, I think that's one of the things that's just kind of been kicked down the road, a bit too hard, a bit too controversial. In terms of closing the gap, looking at my team, we can get back to you on that, but a little bit for housing, yeah. And so, some of the sort of housing schemes have a specific allocation for First Nations housing, which I think is good. But again, like we end up meeting with a bunch of people from the NT and remote communities who are just desperate, not just for more funding, but for better sort of delivery of housing that is, I guess, climate and culturally appropriate. But we can maybe come back to you on that.
I'll jump in, David.
Oh, right, okay.
Just want to go back to the question relating to international students.
Yes.
Now, both political parties have obviously pushing this pretty hard and saying we've got to reduce that number. That has major ramifications for Australian university, particularly the ANU, where we have something like 8,000 or 9,000 students, about nearly half our students are international students, and hence the revenue that flows from that. And so if the government or either political party introduces a major cut to international students, universities across the country are going to be gutted, essentially, because of their income drain. And that will have knock-on effects for sure, particularly if we're trying to build this knowledge economy.
Yep. We've obviously done a lot of consultation and speaking to universities through the Accord process, and just generally consulting with them and hearing what they're up to. There's so little research funding in Australia. We've hit the lowest R&D investment as a percentage of GDP on record, and so what that means for universities is that international student revenue and parking are basically the two only decent untied revenue streams, and they're all basically cross-subsidising their research from international students. And so sure, I think there's a legitimate conversation to be had around how much on-campus accommodation do you have? I mean, the ANU's really invested a lot in on-campus accommodation. How does that compare to the numbers of international students? I think that's a legitimate conversation. But if there are going to be any caps, then we have to look at research funding. How are you actually going to compensate universities? Why do we talk about Future Made in Australia, the knowledge economy, all these things, and have the lowest research budget in the OECD? Those two things don't make sense. So it's something I think we've got a roundtable with the unis next week, to hear more.
Hi, David, and thanks for the opportunity. In economics, in sixth form, I was told about opportunity cost. If you buy a record, you can't have shoes. So I ended up with a lot of music and cold feet. It seems to me that what we're talking about here tonight in a very big sense is opportunity cost. We've got resources, we're making political choices about how to deploy those resources, and a lot of people in this room, and I'm hearing you say, that the way those resources are deployed probably aren't very kind. And I wonder politically how you think we can help. I love the suggestion of my $300 energy rebate going to somebody who could actually use the money. How do we help those who have help those who have not politically?
Well, I guess fundamentally that's what our tax system is about. And I think that's, as sort of a country, to have a government and major parties that are not constantly just talking about tax cuts. Like the number of times we we talked about it, tax cut for every Australian. I mean, is that going to set us up for the future? Or should we be talking about a fair system where we're not seeing this sort of increasing divide of the top and then the rest of Australia? So I think that's part of it. With the energy bill relief, Tash has actually been working on, I don't know if she sent it out yet, but an email encouraging people, if they don't want the energy relief, to donate it to Sue and DVCS. Yep. So I think there's lots of ways. There's so many. One of the things I've loved and has been a real eye opener, to be honest, as a Canberran, is getting around the ACT, and just seeing how much need there is, how many people are genuinely doing it tough. Like, we have this kind of notion that, Canberra's wealthy, so many people doing it tough. And then just how many amazing people are working for no pay to serve their fellow human and to lend a helping hand, from food pantries to frontline services. It really is incredible. And my concern is that if we don't make some fundamental changes, people have less and less time, so they're volunteering less, and then we see loneliness increasing, which is already sort of becoming a real problem, which leads to all sorts of other issues. So I think you've kind of hit one of the key things on the head. How do we talk about things like tax and a system where I'm very willing to give up a chunk of my salary to live in a country that has all of these services, and that I know that my fellow Australians aren't going to bed hungry. And I think for so long we've certainly, my experience moving to Australia as a teenager is people have this notion of universal healthcare, egalitarian society, and when you actually start to look at what's happening to those things, we're starting to lose some of that. And I think it's not too late to change it, right? Yeah. So I don't know what, I'll keep doing what I'm doing in there and keep pushing hard, and listening to people who have great ideas.
Thanks, David. I was just thinking about the $300 that's been transferred to people. It's surely going to go back to the energy companies, is it not?
Yes. So my understanding is it goes straight to the energy company.
Is there a way we can tax that so that it goes back to taking that $300?
I don't think so.
And then going back to domestic violence?
I don't think so. I think it's just a straight up subsidy to the energy companies. So people would have to essentially then just make a donation out of their pocket in lieu of a less on their bill. And I guess there's lots of people have different views on that sort of system. They'll say, well, it's to reduce inflation, because then people don't have that money to spend. Others say, well, it's essentially a fossil fuel subsidy in many ways, because it's going to energy companies.
I was reading today. Is this mic on? Yes. I was reading today about limitarianism, the idea that we should be limiting the amount of income that people can receive and the amount of wealth that people can accumulate. And it was accompanied with some polling figures that showed there was extremely strong support within the Australian population for heavily taxing people with incomes over $10 million a year. Less strong support for taxing accumulated wealth. But I'm wondering how we can have more conversations about these ideas of limiting the amount of wealth that people can accumulate, or the super high salaries that people can receive, in order to shift the Overton window on this and gradually work towards a society where we are genuinely more equal and there's less inequality, and governments are receiving enough money to properly fund all of the services that need to be funded to support people, perhaps even to fund a universal basic income.
10 mil income a year, that's must be doing all right. I don't know. I mean, one of the things I try and talk about is what sort of community and country we want to become. What direction do we want to be heading in? And I think a lot of people recognize that it's not wealth and things that make us happy. It's the human connection and being part of a community and being able to call on your fellow humans in time of need and knowing someone's got your back. You see what happens to towns where there's disasters and communities come together and you look at even some of the mental health stuff where people actually sometimes do a bit better through tough times and wars and all the rest because they are connected to each other. So I think intuitively we know that, but we live in a society that where, I mean, what was the stat? Gambling spends $260 million a year on advertising alone. That's just the gambling industry. So we're just being bombarded by all this stuff. So I don't know, maybe that is one of the roles of really trying to limit some of these more harmful forms of advertising, but I don't think that's going to deal with, I don't know, this kind of obsession with wealth and things, which we know isn't working for us. So I think it's going to take sort of a bottom-up approach where more and more people start to opt out of those things and realize what genuinely is going to make them happy. But again, I think one of the issues with trying to talk about all of this stuff is in a country that we are genuinely one of the wealthiest countries in the world, but most people, that's not their experience. Like some crazy percentage of people are in either mortgage stress or rental stress. And so we've got this system that really isn't set up for human flourishing. And so I think, housing, cost of living are really meaningful ways to free people up to be able to volunteer more and go down and help at their kids' sport and do those sorts of things. Yeah.
So we talked a lot tonight about intergenerational equity, how to make politics and the economy work better for people, as we've just heard. Do you think that extending the electoral cycle by a year, so that each term of government serves, 4 years rather than 3, would assist in shifting the focus to longer-term policy making rather than this really short-term politics we're seeing at the moment?
For sure. I think 3 years is way too short. It should definitely be 4 years, I think, from what I've seen in there. Means another referendum. So I think we actually got the Parliamentary Library to look at this, and Parliament could legislate that the election had to be sort of at the end of the 3-year cycle, and so governments couldn't just call early elections, which would give a bit more certainty. You could then have a bit more scrutiny around their ad spend. It's something we see across the board, really. Governments spending huge amounts of money. I think in the budget there was $45 million to explain Future Made in Australia to Australians. They spent spending $45 million to explain the stage 3 tax cuts to Australians. And they announced that the same week that they announced $12 million for food pantries. So you kind of see the priorities. But yeah, I think terms are one thing. But the bigger thing for me is politicians actually thinking about the future ahead of just short-term political gain.
Hello, David. My name's Jeanette. My question is, what do you understand to be an inheritance tax, and do you support it?
What do I understand it to be? Well, it would be a tax on someone's wealth when they die. Do I support it? I think it depends on the detail of what that looks like, and who like at what level are we talking? What do you reckon?
My understanding would be just like our income tax return, a tiered tax depending on what the inheritance actually is.
Yeah, I'd certainly be willing to look at it and then consult with Canberrans. I mean, I know it's political poison from what I've seen in elections in the past. Australians don't seem to like it. And then, I think some of the very legitimate parts of it is you're looking at, the liquidity issues, say if you've got a family farm or whatever it might be. But would be interested to look at proposals and maybe chat more. But in terms of politics, it seems like there's so much other stuff that we could get done before that around investment, property tax reform, all sorts of things, taxing gas companies.
Yeah, I raised it because if we're talking about the problems with intergenerational wealth, well, the inheritance tax certainly would support that because there would be more income coming to government coffers and not going to others who've done nothing to earn it.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. We've got this, two parties who want to give our gas away for free too. So my focus has very much been on things that I think will make a difference and are really politically possible, because I think once we start to see some reform, the sky doesn't fall. All of a sudden, we've got a lot more funding for all the things that Australians want investment in, from Medicare to dental to all these things. I think there'll potentially be more appetite to say, well, actually, this is not the worst thing. The Scandinavians maybe know a thing or two about the way they set things up.
Hi, David. Thanks for your time and for your work. Sabrina here. Sharon, in her presentation, mentioned the Measuring What Matters consultation that Treasury had at the end of 2022 and then last year again. Was that a tokenistic exercise, or do you see, the well-being framework and the OECD indicators that that exercise presented being discussed and taken seriously? And last year as well in Europe, the 5,000 people gathered at the European Parliament to discuss at a conference called Beyond Growth. Mm-hmm. Do you think that Australia is ready to deprioritize growth and productivity at all costs? And if not, what do we need to do to get there?
I'm going to give you a quick answer and then hand this on if that's all right. I think it can be really meaningful to measure those things. I think one of the legitimate challenges last year was that they really struggled to actually find data. So I think having that every year will mean that we start measuring it more. But I think to hand down that budget, you have to say it's tokenistic, because I can't see it ticking too many of those boxes. In terms of sort of post-growth or economics of arrival, my sense is that Australians are a lot more receptive to that than the political debate. And again, I think to my earlier comments, a lot of people are realising when things don't actually seem to be working that well for us. And so what would it mean to have an economy that served us rather than kind of this economy that we talk about as this kind of abstract thing that is the number one the number one thing. So I think there's a big shift that would need to happen, but I think it's definitely possible. Do you want to add anything on wellbeing economy?
No, but I think we should hand it up to Catherine Trebek. Is that okay, given that she co-founded that whole idea?
So on the measuring what matters, what they have done is put a boost in money to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, because the flack they got when they released a statement last year, quite rightly, was that a lot of the data was out of date, and so wasn't a good reflection on the state of play. So hopefully that journey of continuous improvement will mean that the statement and the dashboard gets better and people start using it. But they, as you know, Sabrina, I complain a lot that they missed a step, which is to have the sort of conversation that you've talked about, David, around what sort of country do we want to be. And that should be a national conversation. There were 2 consultations documents put up on the Treasury website, one of them during summer, so January. So who responds to those sorts of things? What they need to do is properly resource deliberative dialogues across the country, going to places where everyday people hang out. Second best would be a series of citizens' assemblies. There's been a letter sent to the Treasurer calling for a national conversation. My understanding is that there's going to be a meeting between him and some of the signatories to that in the next couple of weeks, but we're not getting much of a sense that they're going to move on that. So the key thing is, how do they know what matters if they haven't asked Australians? But it's not too late, because at least the language in the document is quite humble, and it really is, this is a journey, we're learning, this is our first attempt, let's improve it. So I think the more people say, come on, let's have this discussion about what sort of country we want to be, then hopefully that message will get through.
Yeah, I think there's a genuine opportunity there, but it's really going to take more of us pushing the major parties and then the government of the day to do it. I think that's... Do we have one last question, Tom, or is that... Okay, last question, and then we'll wrap up.
Hi there. I just want to ask a question around the multicultural framework review, with the elections coming up, election cycle coming up, and the narrative around migrants, as we know it, low-hanging fruits for politics. What do you think the report to be prioritized sometime this year, or it would just be pushed until the politics, just so the narrative, the anti-migrant narrative, can continue? What is the position on that?
I don't know, but can try and find out for you. I think one of the things we've seen, which I thought was really interesting, is the government
or grab David himself on the way out the door. Thank you so much, everyone.
the fly just in time.